welcome everyone here to this session that we're going to have today on infant bonding. And it's a very important topic, as we all know. My name is Linda Smith. I am the director of the Early Childhood Initiative here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. For those of you who don't know the Bipartisan Policy Center, we are a Washington, D.C. based think tank. We try to take the best ideas from both sides of the aisle to propose policies that we think can make it through Congress and actually address the most pressing issues in our country. And in my head and my mind, there is no issue more pressing than childcare in this country, and especially childcare for infants, which is the topic that we're going to be speaking about today. Later, we're going to be releasing a report on the status of infant childcare in the country. Without getting into a debate over what's going on with the recent Supreme Court decision, we know that in several places in this country, there will probably be more of a demand for infant care as a result of some of these decisions. And we also know that that care in this country is limited and expensive. And so what we really want to talk today about is sort of what is the importance of infant care and the impact on the developing child. As some of you know, the Department of Labor recently released a report on the cost of care in this country. The cost of care for an infant, and I think these are conservative estimates, range between $8,300 and $17,100 for an infant. They also stated in the report that this lack of care has really serious implications for maternal employment. And it is correlated with the decrease in maternal employment in counties where where care is expensive. So we've got a very complex problem in this country, and we are trying to think about those policies that I mentioned. Where do we go with this? What policies can we propose that would help us improve both the affordability and the access to infant care? So today we're going to take a look at the science behind what's going on with infants, child development, infant bonding, and so forth. And so with me is a dear friend of mine to help us understand this, and that is Dr. Walter Gilliam. He is probably one of the nation's leading experts on this. I've heard Dr. Gilliam talk about this many times, and he can break the science down into, I think, understandable bits, which is so important. He has recently been named as the new executive director of Nebraska University's Buffett Early Childhood Institute. Prior to that, many of you know, he served as a professor of child psychiatry and psychology at Yale University's School of Medicine. And in addition to that, as director of the Ed Ziegler Child Center on Development and Social Policy. And I think we both share a love and a long history with Dr. Ziegler, and he was Walter's mentor. He's a widely published researcher in early care and education, school readiness, and mental health policies. And his research has been focused on intervention policy analysis, specifically on how policies translate into effective services. And I think that's one of the things that we want to talk about today. He's frequently cited in media all over this country and has testified before Congress and works internationally as well. He's a graduate of the University of Kentucky, and where he earned a degree, a PhD in school psychology. Before I start with and ask Walter the first question, I want to remind people that we are going to be turning to you for questions at the end of the session. So we've given, hopefully you all have index cards, and if you have questions, if you could just write those down, and they'll give them up to us. So with all of that, I want to welcome Dr. Gilliam back to BPC. He's been here before. He's a dear friend. And I want to start by asking you, Walter, I know that you've worked with Ed Ziegler for a long time, but beyond his inspiration, what got you into this?
Wow. So first off, let me start by thanking you, Linda, for inviting me to come here. I just deeply admire the work of the Bipartisan Policy Center and have deeply admired your work for a very long time. It's just always such a wonderful treat for me to be in your space. So what got me interested in this was a long process. I mean, I've been at Yale for 28 years, but before then, I was from Kentucky, like you said, and I used to be a public school teacher in Kentucky. And in a way, I'm probably more y'all than Yale. But when I was a teacher in Kentucky, we had a couple of suicides in the school that I taught in, and a child who died in a moped accident. And I ended up rethinking what I wanted to do in my career. I was a music teacher at the time, and then went back to graduate school to be a psychologist. And I was interested in suicidology and adolescence, and ended up through a lot of serendipitous things working with Head Start teachers and childcare providers and preschool special ed teachers and family-based care providers, and just fell in love with the idea of the upstream intervention. The notion that, if I really care about these children as adolescents, when they might be depressed or struggling with all kinds of issues and might be at risk for suicide, then I should be all the more concerned about them when they're preschoolers, when they are toddlers, when they are babies, when the unmet needs that they haven't stripped away so much of their social supports, when they're still cute, when you
Yeah.
can mobilize people around them. If we can't do something beneficial and helpful at that age, it's never going to get any easier. I mean, that is the important moment right there. And I just became totally convinced of it. And so when I was fortunate enough to end up at Yale and able to work with Edward Ziegler, the father of Head Start, and some of the best thinking behind the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993, and with Chris Dodd and other people, it was just a dream come true for me in terms of like where this kind of work could go. And although a lot of the work that we were doing at the very beginning was about Head Start and about pre-K programs, I mean, it was never lost that it's really about the babies. That it's about the babies. It's about the really young children. It's about the very beginnings of life. That to many people, many policymakers, 3 and 4 might sound like the beginning of life. That is not the beginning of life. They don't begin when they end up in systems. They begin when they end up in our arms. And that's at the time that they're born. And so to be able to have this kind of a conversation, to be able to take everything that we know about the importance of relationships, relationships between babies and their parents, or young children and their childcare providers, their teachers, and to be able to take that to be able to inform, well, what should we be doing in terms of policy to make sure that we have the systems in place, the supports in place for parents to be able to have that time with their babies. In a way, it's a bit of a homecoming for me
Yeah.
to be able to come back to this topic.
Mhm. Well, I think it goes without saying that in our lifetime, we've seen huge advances in the research around all of this, and especially around the brain development. A lot of people understand that. What do you think have been the biggest developments in that you've seen in your lifetime that impact what we're talking about here today? And that's pretty much infant bonding.
I mean, there's been a lot of things that we've learned. I think there's a lot of things that we kind of intuitively knew about children, and eventually science catches up to what we already knew. Now we can show it and convince people who I guess probably also knew it but didn't really want to think it and say it, because then if you think it and say it, you must do something about it. And when I think about some of the things that have been the most impactful to me, aside from the fact that I suppose the most impactful thing is that so often we know exactly what we should do and yet choose to do something else. But aside from that, I would say some of the research having to do with neurotransmitters, and the fact that when babies are born, mothers can get this spike in oxytocin. I think many people have heard about this, and oxytocin has been shown in rat studies and mouse studies and things like that to be associated with a drive to cuddle, to be able to to want to take care of the pup, to lick the pup, to cuddle with the pup, to spend time with the pup. And when you do studies with mice, you can see that demonstrated right there. But it naturally happens within the course of birth for a mother. But then what I think was surprising to some people is it happens in fathers too. If he was in the room to see the birth, dad gets an oxytocin spike too.
Interesting.
That basically, when you think about this, I mean, babies, when they're born, they come out with a relatively limited field of vision. They can only really see very well about 7 to 12 inches away from them. Anything much closer to that is kind of fuzzy. Anything much farther than that is kind of fuzzy. Their entire world is 7 to 12 inches away from their eyes, which is right about there, right about there. They come to us wired to know that the most important things in the entire world are right about there. And if you take a newborn baby, you can see that they can recognize the scent of their mother. You give them scented claws on both sides, they'll reliably turn their head towards the scent of the mother. If you give a child two pictures, say for instance, a picture of a face and the picture of a car, which way will a newborn baby or a baby just a few days old turn their head? Towards the face or the car?
Mhm.
To their face, yes. Okay, what about if I give a baby a picture of a face and a Lamborghini? To the face. What about if you give a child a picture of a circle or a square? Circle. What about a circle or a more oblong circle? Anything that looks at least a little bit like a face. That's what they're seeking out. This is their world, and they are seeking it out. They are seeking out those faces. And what's incredible to me is that that baby is born wired up to seek out important adults in their life because they depend on that. And in the process of birthing, we become rewired to reciprocate that. But unfortunately, our policies oftentimes get in the way and make it difficult for the things that have been put inside of us to actually be able to be expressed in the terms of the way in which we take care of and nurture our young children.
Wow. So, Walter, and I think to some people, and I think to policymakers, some of what you're saying is not really known. I mean, I think the first time I heard you talk about that, I was surprised in terms of, especially that triggers in the father as well. Why have we not, has this science not made it to the public more and to policymakers? Where are we missing something? Why are we missing this?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it?
It really is, yeah.
Like, why is it that we often don't do what we know we should?
Hmm.
In a way, that's kind of the nature of the question that you're talking about. I mean, I guess I could say, well, why is it that we don't fund childcare like we should? Why is it that we don't take care of the needs of women during pregnancy like we should? My guess is it's because we want to, at election time, kiss the baby, and to quote a dear friend of mine, not necessarily mean it when we kiss the baby. That we will say things about the importance of young children and families, but in the end, we just don't want to put our resources in any kind of a way that would make that clear. That young children don't vote, and those who care for them haven't been mobilized very well to vote, and they don't lobby well, young children, you know. And as a result, they just tend to fall by the wayside. We certainly have enough science to know that this is something that we should do. And we certainly know when you survey and you look at paid parental leave policies of Fortune 500 companies, that the most successful Fortune 500 companies know to do that too in order to attract high quality applicants, that they'll offer paid parental leave, especially in the C-suite. They know,
Hmm.
but as a country, apparently, we probably know, yet we chose not to do. We did pass in 1993, as you know, as we all know, unpaid Family Leave Act that provides a period of time when fathers can stay home with their baby and be able to take care of them. And now we have, I think, 10 states that have some sort of a paid parental leave policy, and the federal government has it for military. employees, paid parental leave. We know that we should be doing it. The question, I think, basically is how do you message it out as an imperative? And then how do you figure out exactly who should foot the bill for that? And ultimately, that has become, I think, the challenge.
Well, we also know, from the studies that have been done, is that most, what is it, a quarter of mothers go back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth. What is that? What's the impact of that on the parent-child relationship, in your view?
Yeah, and they go back so soon,
Too.
so soon, so soon. It used to be, for many mothers when they would give birth to a child and they would stay a period of time in the hospital. And now, you give birth and how long do you stay in the hospital before you're back, discharged from the hospital and you're back home? And then the expectation is that you're going to be back at work within a relatively short period of time. Terrible for the mother, terrible for the baby. I would say terrible for the father and everybody else in that family, and certainly not a good way to build a company. And many of our Fortune 500 companies that invest in paid parental leave know that. They just have the resources to do it. And so I, when I think about it from that perspective, one of the things that kind of comes to mind is one, clearly, a couple of weeks is not enough time. That if we were to have 6 weeks at the bare minimum, or preferably 8 or 18, many countries certainly have a whole lot more than that. You know, Many countries who have a far less amount of resources than the United States does do a whole lot more than that for their families. If we were to be able to provide just a little bit of time through a national paid parental leave, can you imagine some of the things that it would do? One of the things that kind of pops to my mind is this. If we had something like that, we would know two things. Just by virtue of the fact that if you're taking paid parental leave, I know a couple of things about you. One, you have a job. And I know exactly also when you're going to be going back to work, because I know when the paid parental leave will end. And with that information, we already invest in things like child care resource and referral agencies. Could you imagine if child care resource and referral agencies already had a 6-week head start in helping you to be able to find child care? Or if all of the things that we invest in terms of early literacy and other things like that, pediatric care, had a head start? We invest a lot of money in Child Find for special education, essentially for early intervention services. How do you go out and find the children who are eligible? This would already be Child Find. We'd already know it, and we would know what the child care needs are and exactly when they were needed, and we could plan around that. To be able to think about how we could streamline all the services necessary for that mother and family and baby to be able to succeed is just incredible to me. We just don't do it.
Let me go back though and ask you. I mean, sort of, what is the impact on the baby's development when this mother is, at 2 weeks going back to work, and we know we don't have childcare for these babies. They are, in many ways, having to bounce around in terms of the care. There may be a relative, maybe a neighbor, whatever. What's the impact on the baby on that?
Wow. When you said bounce around, it reminded me of the fact that many folks who do not have a home basically bounce around from one location to another location. And in a way, what you're describing is you're talking about care homelessness. This is a
That's a
young
good way to
child,
put
a
it.
baby who has no care home, and then is bouncing around from one location to another location. Some of the times, the best way to be able to see the effects of something is to be able to do a study where you remove the something and see how it improved things. And when you look at studies after the institution of paid parental leave programs, you can see things like improved healthcare, fewer ER visits, decrease in child abuse and neglect cases, all kinds of things that are wonderful, amazing, terrific things about the health and social emotional development and overall cognitive development of that baby.
Mhm.
And so when you can see that as a positive effect of the policy, then you know that the opposite of that is the effect of not having the policy. Some people might say, well, what about the cost of paid parental leave? to which you can then respond, what about the cost of not? What about the cost of that child abuse? What about the cost of the neglect? What about the cost of all the social services necessary in order to be able to repair the damage that we cause because we don't plan ahead for the needs of a newborn baby?
Does this impact parent bonding? I mean, in terms of what the child is getting and the continuity of it. What is the impact on the baby on that lack of opportunity, I guess, or ability to bond with the adults?
Yeah, that oxytocin pump that you get right at the very beginning, it's to start the process. It's to start the process, and then that process, of course, can get disrupted. If there's no time for the parent to be able to spend with the baby, it's incredibly important to mothers. And we haven't even talked about postpartum depression and the effects of postpartum depression and the importance of being able to make sure that we're able to support not just the mother, not just the baby, not just the family, not just the baby, but that dyad, the connection of those two. And to be able to make sure that they have that time to be able to form a connection, that we can provide the supports and wrap those supports around them in that time, and then be able to ease that parent back into the work environment.
So, Dr. Gilliam, what do you say to people who are running childcare programs for infants? What should they be looking at in all of this? I think we talk about we have a lack of infant care in this country. We know nothing about the quality of it. What do you think are the most important things that we should be looking at in terms of the quality of infant care?
Well, I mean, that's a whole event, isn't it?
Yes.
About the quality of infant care and what we know about that. I mean, we know that it's more expensive to take care of infants and toddlers than it is to take care of preschoolers, simply because of the amount of babies that an adult can take care of compared to preschoolers. And so because of the differences in the ratios, of course the cost is going to be different. But oftentimes when I hear people talk about issues of cost and access, I hear them talk about how expensive childcare is. And I would challenge us to think a little bit differently about that. Childcare is really not any more expensive than any other high-touch industry. It's not really a whole lot more expensive than K through 12 or higher education or elder care or any other kind of a high-touch industry. It's just that in those other industries, we subsidize it. And in this case, we take the full brunt of that cost and push it onto the parents. It's not that it's more expensive, it's just that the expense is felt acutely by the parents because we don't subsidize it. If we did subsidize it better, then we would probably be able to attract more people into the early care and education industry on the whole, and certainly within infant toddler care. When you think about, like when you go out and you look at, at childcare programs, you can certainly find a lot of childcare programs that just serve preschoolers, 3, 4, or 5-year-olds. And you might be able to find a few that serve 3, 4, and 5-year-olds and also infants and toddlers. How often can you find a childcare center that only serves infants?
Hmm.
You can't really find them, right? Why? Because it'd be impossible to do. Because the little meager margins that we make off of the preschoolers offsets the cost of the infants and toddlers, at least a little bit, to be able to make it affordable. That's the only reason that they're able to serve infants and toddlers is because of the preschoolers in there. And so as we ramp up more state-funded pre-K programs and pre-K programs are vying for those children, it certainly has to make you wonder what's going to happen to the infant toddler care when that little teeny tiny margin is removed from the books, from the accounting books. Can they be able to afford to be able to continue to provide infant toddler care? I'm incredibly worried about that.
I think a lot of us are. Let me ask you a question. This is the hard one, and I didn't actually tell you in advance that I was going to ask this, so I apologize.
Okay. No, it's all right.
The one thing in some of the travels that we've been doing of late, in some of the states where we're really challenged with this issue of cost, and I've heard it more than probably a dozen times in the last few months. What if we just increase the ratios? And will that help us balance and get more care? out there. We, generally speaking, the ratios are 1 to 4 in this country, almost everywhere. Some 1 to 3, some higher, but mostly 1 to 4. What do you think the impact would be on all that we've talked about on the science and the bonding and all of the rest if states were to think about increasing those ratios, which they are thinking about in some states?
You're right. I didn't know that question was coming, but it's not a hard one. It's not. I mean, that's a terrible idea. That's a terrible. And let me say why I would think that that's a terrible idea. And I would love to hear your thoughts and everybody else's thoughts. But the reason why I think it's a terrible idea is what it's basically saying is we know that the care is expensive. Well, let me back up. We know that the quality of the experience from the baby's perspective, from the toddler's perspective, has to do with the amount of availability of a caring adult in their life to be able to take care of them. And the more babies and toddlers there are per adult, the more their experience suffers. And so when I think about it from that perspective, all I'm hearing in this is we know that the care is expensive, but we adults don't want to pay it. So we're going to make the baby pay for it. That's literally what I'm hearing in it. We don't want to pay for it, so the baby gets to pay for it. They get to pay for it in terms of a diminished experience. But aside from that, we have things like caring for our children, which has come down really strong on the types of ratios that would be needed, not only for optimal child development, but just for pure safety reasons. To be able to take care of children. If you have to evacuate a baby, say for instance, like I'm just thinking, I'm spitballing this one, but say for instance you have to immediately evacuate a child care program for any kind of an emergency that you can possibly imagine. If you have preschoolers, you can try to corral them and they can walk because they ambulate. How many infants can you carry? You know what I mean? Like, how many infants can any adult possibly even just take care of on a regular basis? If you then increase the ratio, all it is a short-term fix for a very long-term problem. But I can also think about it from another perspective, because I understand that the idea behind it too is to try to be able to get enough workforce. I mean, it's about the cost, but it's also about finding the workforce. And I can tell you this, one of the main drivers or main correlates of childcare provider stress is ratios. When ratios go up, stress rates go up. And when stress rates go up, burnout goes up. And you know what else goes up? Leaving the field. So it may feel like a good solution, but in the long run, it is a bad solution.
I think that's one of the things that we haven't stressed enough is the link to the burnout and the workforce. I think it's easier to talk about the health and safety aspects. It's hard to envision somebody carrying 5 babies out of a child care center. It just is. Before we turn to some audience questions, Walter, in your mind, what would be 2 or 3 things that we could do in this country policy-wise that could or should do? What are the top things that we should be thinking about in this country?
Well, starting on the topic that we're talking about here, I mean, I think we should be talking about passing a nationwide paid parental leave program and linking that paid parental leave to the supports that already exist, like child care resource and referral agencies, like pediatric care. I mean, we have these other systems in place, and if we were to be able to fund a reasonable, I'm not talking about anything like outlandish. I mean, 120 countries have this. 120 countries have this. And some states have this. And the Fortune 500 companies, and they know about money, they do it too. We could do this. And not only could we do this, but we could link it up with other services and be able to make those other services more efficient. That, I think, is something that we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on truly subsidizing the care of our young children as an important infrastructure in the United States. I mean, goodness knows we subsidize just about everything else you can imagine. We subsidize dairy products, we subsidize oil, we subsidize corn, we subsidize a lot of other stuff. We can certainly subsidize our children's care, right? I mean, if where you put your money is where your values lie, then all it tells me is this: we care a whole lot more about corn than we care about babies. And that's a problem. We could be doing both of those things.
Mhm.
And it also tells me when I think about this that we should be thinking about the disparities in access to all of this. That we should not be a country that tolerates the fact that if you're a mother of color, you're more likely to die in childbirth. We cannot tolerate something like that. We should not tolerate those kind of inequities in the very problems that we're talking about. Because in the end, we're talking about systemic problems that face all of us in terms of the amount of care and the quality of the care that we can provide our children. But the brunt of those challenges are not equitably distributed. Some carry the brunt much, much heavier.
Okay, I want to turn it over now and see if we have any questions from our audience for Dr. Gilliam. So I don't know if we've collected any cards or anything.
Or Walter, you don't have to keep calling me.
I know. I'm trying to be very professional.
Well, you are.
Okay. So one of the things that as we think about this, if if you are a parent and you've mentioned the child care resource and referral system and some of the other things, what should parents really be looking for in child care? You're a new parent and you're this new baby, and you know you have to go back to work. What should you be thinking about looking at?
Wow. It's a great question. And I think oftentimes we default to answers that present something that's quantifiable. Like, do you have a certain kind of accreditation? Yes or no? Do you have a certain kind of ratio? What's the number on that? Or even how many books do you have? I mean, things that we can count, things that we can quantify. But if I were to say, like, what do I think is based on the science based on what I know here and what I know here, if I were to say, what would be the most important thing if I were a parent?
Mhm.
When I see you with my child, when I see you with my baby, do you look like you love my baby? Do you seem like you really want to be with my baby? That my child brings you delight? I mean, what is the biggest worry that any parent has about their child? I can't imagine one that's bigger than the worry that the world will not love my baby like I do. I mean, the world will not love my baby like I do. The world will not take care of my baby like I do. The world will be a meaner place to my baby than what I would want for my baby. I mean, that is like a parent's biggest fear, isn't it? It's the thing that makes it hard to let your babies go into the world. And yet letting our babies go into the world is the process of parenting. That is what it is all about. It's about letting your babies go into the world with supports. But the thing that can be a challenge to that is the worry about whether or not the world is going to love my baby like I love my baby. In the end, I think the biggest question that any parent should have is when I see you with children, when I see you with my child, does it look like you love that baby? Does it look like you are happy to be around my child? Do you light up when my child comes in? And does my child light up when my child sees you? Those kind of things. Everything else is a moderator to that variable. If you have too many children per adult, it makes that harder. If you have a stressed out teacher, it makes that harder. If you have a teacher who doesn't know whether they're going to be able to make the rent payment, it makes that harder. Everything else, all the other policies that I can think of, are policies that are moderators to that main core question of, do you, as a caregiver for my child, love my baby like I love my baby?
I'm not sure what the question is in this, but this is it makes me want to ask a question. And this is a comment about in DC. We're pretty good. They're doing a lot with childcare right now here in the district. Started out with pre-K, moving down in the age groups, fours, threes, and now into the toddler area. It seems like we started from the top down rather the bottom up. And what you're describing is infants and toddlers and the importance of, what goes on in those early weeks and months. Seems like we've got this a little bit upside down in this country, not just in DC, in the country.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be the first time we got things upside down. I mean, it probably won't be the last either. You know, I mean, here's just And where did the question come from? Do we know who? So somebody in the
Over
audience
here.
posted. Oh, wonderful. Like one of the things that when I think about this, about like this issue of why is it that we don't think from from baby up, or even from the decision that I want to have a child in my family up, you know, instead of that, we think about it from school age down. I think there's a lot of reasons behind that, and part of it might have to do with, sort of like thinking about K through 12 curriculum, and then how do you get people ready for that, and then how do you make school readiness programs, and how do you make school readiness programs, and readiness school, like how do you keep pushing things backwards? I think that's part of it, but my guess is probably something even more fundamental than that. Over the last 40 some years, the United States, just like a lot of other countries, have been experiencing declining reproductive rates. Fewer and fewer children are born every single year for about the past 4 decades. On top of that, in the schools, many children now are going to charter schools, private schools, parochial schools, homeschooling. On top of that, some states are experiencing higher than other states rates of outmigration. When you put all of that together, what does that equal? It equals fewer and fewer students, K through 12, in the public schools. Fewer students that are available to the public schools. And fewer students means more out of work teachers. Teachers need to have students in order to be able to keep the schools open. Schools need to find the students. The real estate beyond 12th grade is already taken by higher education and vocational education. So where is the open real estate? The open real estate is in preschool. And so we then expand the school systems down into the preschool years in order to be able to then find more students. I remember when we were doing a study back in 2005 of state-funded pre-K programs, the state that had the highest rate of teachers with bachelor's and master's degrees in the nation at that time in our study of state-funded pre-K programs was West Virginia. And I had a reporter who contacted me and said, why is it, do you think that West Virginia would have she was a reporter from West Virginia. She was surprised by the finding. Why is it that West Virginia would have the highest rate of teachers with bachelor's and master's degrees teaching preschool? And I said, well, I don't know. I know that we found that, but since you're an investigative reporter, maybe you can go figure it out, and please let me know if you do, and so she went to the legislature and she was asking questions, and they were ramping up a universal pre-K system in West Virginia. And guess what she found out? The program had a nickname at the time. In the legislature, they were calling it the Out of Work Teachers Program. And basically, they were seeing it as a way to be able to keep teachers employed. And so when I think about those kind of market factors that drive this, I mean, I can't help but think that's going to have a big impact on the childcare industry. That's going to have a big impact on the quality of care that children receive. And it's going to have a big impact on all sorts of things having to do with families and children. And the main driver of it is economics. Nothing at all to do with children and families.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions here. What is the impact? It gets to the teacher issue. What is the impact of teacher turnover on infant bonding? And I think that's pretty important given what's going on with the early childhood workforce right now.
Yeah, I wish I knew what the teacher turnover rate was in infant care compared to the teacher turnover rate in toddler versus preschoolers. Does anyone here in the audience know that? I don't know of any study specifically comparing those, but my gut tells me that the rate is probably higher in infant care, simply because the conditions are much harder there. We don't pay them as well. We don't have as many supports for them. And the structures in which they're located typically don't have as many supports in place too. So I would imagine that the turnover rate is probably greater there. If there was ever a time in the life of a human being that they need to have more consistency, it's going to be in the earliest days and months and years. And for them to be able to have that much turnover, for them to have to, they're born into a family, and then within a short period of time, they have to be dropped off with another adult who I would imagine in most cases is incredibly caring and well-meaning, but that's a stranger until the baby gets used to that, and then that baby leaves, or that child care provider leaves, and then they end up having to get used to another one. There was I don't want to wax long on this, but there was an incredible set of videos that were produced by a husband and wife team of social workers in London. They were the Robertsons, and they were working in London, and they were interested in what happens to babies when they have a sibling who was born. And in London, it was common, for mothers to go to the hospital, and the mother would be in the hospital for maybe a week or 10 days. This was in the 60s. And so not anytime recently. And so they were concerned about, well, what happens to the older siblings? And it was fairly common in some places there that if the father had to work and mom's going to be in the hospital for 7, 10, 11, 12 days, that the older sibling, who could be 15 months, 2 years, something like that, would be taken to an orphanage and left at an orphanage for that period of time, and dad might come in and visit. And the Robertsons thought, this is absolutely horrific. This is terrible. And so they filmed it every single day in the lives of many children who are being dropped off there. They would film, the first day before they dropped them off, and you would see this well-adjusted child who's interacting well with her parent. And then they would film the next day and the next day and the next day. And you could literally watch this child's development deteriorate. At first, they cried a lot. And then after a while, when they realized that their cries weren't going to be met with any kind of a response because the orphanage workers were overworked and understaffed, the babies stopped crying. And then you noticed that when they were coming in there, they were walking with a really nice heel-to-toe kind of gait. And then they started doing more of a flat foot gait with a wider gait, where they started losing some language. You saw them actually literally developmentally regress. But then when you looked at the care and you tried to see, well, what was happening in the course of that care, because they had so many infants to care for per adult, somebody was in charge of the bathing, somebody was in charge of the feeding, somebody was in charge of the putting them down for the nap time, and then they would literally rotate them, basically babies on a factory line. And that was basically how we were treating those children then in London. And in some respects, things are better now, and in some respects, not at all. We still do not support those who care for infants and toddlers well enough for them to be able to provide the care that they know in their heart that they would like to be able to provide.
So, Walter, we have quite a few questions here. I want to get to some of
I should
these.
talk quicker and not
Yes.
tell long stories about the 60s.
Okay. I think this one is really important to the early childhood community. And it says, what is your perspective on the credentials debate for childcare providers? Given we can't test for loving children, how do we ensure high quality childcare providers?
That we can't test for loving children. What does that mean?
Well, I think it means that you can't. I mean, there are so many things when you can't. What? That's a good question. It means you can't. There's no test that shows whether you love a child or not. Okay. So, I mean, what should we be doing? And we've been having conversations here about this issue on credentials, degrees. There's all kinds of debates within the field right now, and the fact that we've probably gone backwards on some of this over the last few years with COVID. We've lost a lot of our good teachers. So how do we begin to build that capacity, and what do we do to make sure it's good?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know that there's been a lot of effort to try to professionalize the field, and to try to make a field of early care and education that's seen as an actual profession. And that by, I guess the thinking was that by requiring certain degrees and certification, that would give it some of the trappings of professionalism. And, there's a lot of things that sort of define a profession. Professions typically do have some kind of injury requirement. Professions are usually self-policing, like doctors determine whether or not other doctors have done something that a doctor shouldn't be doing. Lawyers police other lawyers, basically professions are oftentimes a profession that's self-policing and self-organizing, and they have to do that because the consumer is not in a position to be able to determine whether or not that professional knows what they're doing. And so the professions themselves will police it. We don't have a lot of those kind of mechanisms within early care and education. We certainly have the danger of harm if it's not done well, that exists. But to have all these other kind of mechanisms, we don't. And so I think in a way we were hoping that if we could create some kind of educational requirement, it would create some kind of appearance of a profession. But if when I think about it from a market perspective, because the market is always there, you know, requiring higher degrees doesn't necessarily mean that teachers are going to be better compensated. But if teachers were better compensated, they would get higher degrees to get the jobs. You know what I mean? Compensation will drive the professionalism a whole lot better than if we sort of force an appearance of it through just requiring the education. And I don't say that to say that teacher education isn't important, or that teacher, pre-service education, that we can't teach a lot of important things. But I do worry about our ability to be able to get very far down that road without finding some kind of a way to significantly infuse more resources into the early care and education industry through better subsidization.
One of the things that, and I think we're dancing around, and you brought up this issue of the schools and probably pushing down into the 3s and 4s, and we saw that a little bit when I was with the Defense Department in the military, when we were closing schools and teachers were put down into the pre-K programs. And I think the biggest thing that I saw in all of that is the difference. I think it's pretty simple, and yet it's not. It's often missed. Is that teachers who are used to teaching in the elementary schools do teacher-directed teaching, and in early childhood we need child-directed teaching. And if we could just do something with the teachers that try to make that transition, I think we could do a lot more in the case of schools and so forth that you're talking about.
Yeah, and that model that you're talking about is incredibly demanding.
Mhm.
I mean, it's really hard
Well,
to individualize your education and your teaching. And yet, just like you said, we know that that's what our youngest children need.
right.
And so what we've essentially done is we created a system where those who have to do the very hardest work are compensated at the very least.
I've told the story. I told the story when I was at HHS a lot about watching my own grandson transition from a really good childcare program to a pre-K program, and the first being child directed, the second he was so frustrated with the teacher directed. Sit at the desk. Here's where your name is. You can't go anywhere unless you ask. That kind of. I went and observed, and I thought, this is probably with my grandson going nowhere. But anyway, let's keep going here. I do think it's an issue though that we need to talk about in the younger. The more we tend to do that in our school system, I think we need to pay attention to it. These children are very frustrated in these circumstances. How does the current childcare systems disproportionately affect low-income families? I'm interested in what you say on that one. Then I'm going to offer my 2 cents.
Wow, that's such a big question. Like, I don't even know where to start with that. It's with the exception of some programs like Head Start and Early Head Start, it's much more difficult, of course, for low-income families to be able to gain access into programs at all. Much more difficult for them to be able to gain access into better resourced programs that can be able to provide more resources for their children. And in many cases, we also know that our lower income families and our children and families of color are more likely, if they are able to get into the program, to then get kicked back out. We know that, and we've known that for a long time. What's particularly egregious about this, I think, is this. when you think about like the main studies that make the case for why early care and education matters, why should we invest in early care and education? What are the studies that pop to mind? You think about like the Perry Preschool study in Ypsilanti, Michigan. You think about the Abecedarian study in Chapel Hill. You think about the Chicago Child Parent Center study. I mean, these all have cost-benefit analyses that allow us to say things like every dollar that's spent on early care and education yields $7, and all the things that you say. But one of the things that we often like forget to say is this: the Perry Preschool study was a study in the 60s, and every single one of the children were low income and black. Every single one of them. And in the Abecedarian study, they were all low income and 98% black. And in the Chicago Child Parent Center, they were 93% black. And what we've done here in this country is we've used data that came from our poorest families and from our families of color to be able to create a program for the benefit of all of our children. And then when no one's paying attention, we make it harder to get in and easier to get kicked out. The very children whose data made those programs possible in the first place. To me, that's what makes it go from something that is terrible and unfortunate to egregious and incredibly immoral and unethical.
Can I add into that too? Because I do think that in this country, when it comes to childcare, the families who qualify for, let's say, the subsidies or qualify for some Head Start, early Head Start, et cetera, that's one thing. But the families who either don't get in or don't qualify income-wise, those are the children that I think right between that and middle income families are where I worry about children, because we act like they're in care, and I hear the quotes all the time about, well, these low income families pay 50% of their income for childcare. No, they don't. They're not in childcare. They're the kids that are somewhere and we don't know where they are, rather than they're in programs because their parents, you can't afford it. You just aren't there if you don't get the help. And I think where we as a country really have got to start focusing on just those kids above poverty level that are not, where are they? I think that's where the system really fails families, and we're very silent about it.
Well,
So
Linda, I remember that in the 2014 CCDBG legislation, that you were incredibly instrumental to getting that reauthorization passed, and
right.
that one of the provisions in there had to do with means testing. That very issue that you're raising right there.
Yeah.
It's been a long-standing problem.
I think we're just about running out of time, and we do have several more questions here. And I think this one is, well, there's a couple. Let me go back here and look at this because it says out of the current states that have invested in parental leave, you talked about that earlier. What do you think the federal government should learn from them and enact at the federal level? You've kind of talked about that, but
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some states that have started up paid parental leave programs. Connecticut's one of the more recent ones where I'm currently located. If we were really serious, thoughtful, we'd be studying the effects of these things and realizing that the United States, whenever we push things down from the federal government and put it within the responsibility of states, that we basically have a steady population pool of 50 individual states. We could be looking at the impacts of this that happens within individual states and then using that to be able to guide federal policy if we were more serious and deliberate about it. But I think if we did look at it, I mean, based on the evidence that I've seen so far, it's widely popular. People participate in it. Doesn't seem to break anybody's bank so far. And it generates lots of positive outcomes for families, for babies, and for employers.
okay. Well, we are out of time here, and I know we need to move on, but I just want to say in closing how much we appreciate you doing this with us. I think we do have to take a real serious look at what we're doing about infant care in the next few years. I think this is going to become a challenge for this country, and especially in some states where the laws are shifting and changing. The one thing that we say, and and just in closing, we say here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, is that we need to start looking at all policies, not just one. I think if we look at what is the combination of paid leave, with childcare, with tax policy, how can we help some more families with that? There won't be a single solution, and I think we need to be getting really serious about this. And so, in closing, I just really appreciate Walter you taking the time to come down and talk to us and to talk to our audience, and hopefully we can help educate some people on the importance of these very very early days and weeks and months for a baby.
No, it's a delight for me, and it's always wonderful to have time with you. And thank you so much, Linda, for your longstanding leadership in this field and for all the great work that's happening here at the Policy Center with you and so many other people. Just thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay, well,
It's a
thank you,
pleasure.
and I think talk again soon. Thank you, everyone, for coming.